Now, the faith in particular that I want us to look at is the faith of Abraham. Now, Abram and Abram are the same people. He has a name change. I'll probably use those interchangeably, and I'll tell you why he had a name change in a future episode. Arguably, Abram is the model of faith. And I would even go as far as saying that his faith was a lot more challenging for him to live out than, say, maybe the faiths of Mary and even Jesus. Now, whoa, I know I'm getting controversial here, but why I would say that about Abraham is think about what Mary and Jesus had in common. They had a whole Hebrew scriptures to fall back on. They had a lineage of prophets. They had priests. They had the temple. They had sources of information regarding the faith. Abraham had none of that. Nothing! The story of Abraham begins in Genesis chapter 12. Genesis chapter 12, unlike the first 11 chapters of Genesis, is now considered historical narrative for the most part, but that's not to say we're still not going to encounter different literary forms and devices and figurative language. We do believe that Abraham was a historical person, lived sometime around 1800 or 2000 BC. Abraham is regarded as the founding father of Judaism because he is the person that God is going to form his initial covenant with. Saint James in the New Testament says that faith without works is dead. Without acting and living upon your faith, it's not really faith. It might as well be non-existent. A faith is only as good as you're living it out in action or producing works that demonstrate your faith. We see that with Abraham. So Abraham is from Mesopotamia. It's a polytheistic culture. He's part of the Apuru people. When we first encounter Abraham in Genesis 12, he's still known as Abram. His wife is Sarai. They are an older couple. They are barren. And God makes contact with him in Genesis 12 and says, I will produce from you a great people, pick up your stuff and go to a land that I'll tell you when you're there. We're seeing Abraham's righteousness. We're seeing his obedience. He doesn't question this God. Who are you? Why should I pick up my stuff and follow you? He puts complete trust into this unknown God. This is a culture where a lot of times gods play tricks on humans, but Abraham felt this is going to be okay to do. And he demonstrates that through the work of picking up his family and going. You can compare this to Jesus in the New Testament when he calls upon the apostles and they're willing to drop their nets to go follow Jesus. They're dropping their livelihood to go follow Jesus. Not only does he take his wife, he takes his slaves, he takes his cattle, he takes his brother's son, and aka his nephew named Lot. The Lot group and the Abraham group are not getting along well. There's just a lot of frustration upon this journey. And ultimately Abraham says to Lot, listen, we can go our separate ways. You can choose the road you want to take, we'll go opposite. Ultimately, Lot and his family end up in the land of Sodom, which is going to be described as the land of sin, and will be destroyed by fire from heaven. Abraham ends up in what we'll eventually know as Canaan, the land flowing with milk and honey. It'll be referred to as the promised land. And think about where these two men end up. Abraham and his family are in the land flowing with milk and honey. Lot ends up in a land of sin and fire. You can make this kind of an eschatological analogy that we have free will, and if we trust in God, we can end up in this heavenly place, the land flowing with milk and honey, the garden imagery again. Or if you want to do what you want to do because it's more convenient for you, you might end up in a fiery hell, a land of sin. Now, I'm not dissing Lot. There's nothing in Scripture that indicates that Lot is a bad man. And unfortunately, this decision to separate is going to lead him down a series of unfortunate events that maybe I'll get to in the future. But what I like about the separation story is that it does demonstrate that Abraham has free will. So our God is not forcing Abraham to go to this land. This is Abraham's free free choice. Now I'm going to skip 10 chapters of Genesis to get to Genesis chapter 22, the sacrifice of Isaac. Now, as we do the Abraham stories, I'm not doing these stories chronological. Instead, I want to do them thematically as I want to make some points as we explore Abraham. The sacrifice of Isaac story is one of the best typologies in the Hebrew Scriptures. Typology! What happens in the story? Genesis chapter 22. God says to Abraham, I want you to sacrifice your son, your only son, who you love above all else, for me. Now, your immediate reaction is, whoa, what kind of God is this? And in fact, what kind of man is Abraham not to question this? But you got to think about Abraham's culture once more. It was common practice in these ancient biblical times to offer human sacrifice. And, Abraham's still getting to know this God, and maybe, okay, fine, maybe this God is into that. Typically, it would be young girls, because men were considered more important in this culture. You were legally allowed to kill your kids, to sacrifice your kids, to sell your kids. They were on the same level as cattle when it came to the Mesopotamian law. You could kill your kids up until the age of 12. Abraham asks Isaac to carry the wood up a hill. So you can see the typology. Isaac is Abraham's only son. Now, yeah, there's this kid named Ishmael that was actually born within these other 10 chapters, but I'll talk more about him later. Ishmael doesn't currently live in the household with Abraham. So as far as Abraham is concerned, Isaac is his only son. And he makes his son carry this wood up a hill to be used to execute him. Hello, Jesus imagery. Then he lies to his son. Poor Isaac asks Dad, where's the animal? What are we sacrificing? And Abraham goes, oh, don't worry, God will provide. Next thing you know, he has Isaac bound. He's about to raise the dagger to slaughter his son. And just then an angel comes down and says, oh, no, this was just a test. Our God isn't in the human sacrifices. Good for you, you passed this test. Here's a lamb that you can use now instead as a sacrifice. You can make the case that this lamb is an innocent lamb that is slaughtered so that the young boy Isaac can live. Jesus, of course, is the paschal lamb who is slaughtered, who is sacrificed for us so that we can live. So you have like two different ways you could do this typology in Genesis chapter 22. The scripture doesn't say what did Isaac think about this encounter. And it's not really Isaac's story right now, so that's probably why the scribes never spelled out Isaac's reaction. But what is interesting to point out that as you continue to page through Genesis here, up until when Abraham dies, there is no mention of Abraham and Isaac ever having a face-to-face conversation again. Isaac is deeply disturbed, he's deeply depressed when his mother Sarah dies, and they say that this is a depression, this is a grief that is never relieved until he meets his wife Rebecca. And that makes sense from a human psychological standpoint. Your dad just lied to you and tried to kill you. Are you ever going to trust him again? And you can make the case that Isaac doesn't trust his dad again, and he gravitates towards Sarah, his mom. Well, Sarah passes, Isaac moves away, Dad tries to arrange a marriage with Isaac, but he does it through messengers. He doesn't do it face to face. There's no real account of poor Isaac ever talking to his dad again. And although the angel stops Abraham from physically sacrificing his son, in a sense, Abraham still ends up having to make a sacrifice. He sacrifices the relationship, what he once had with his son. And I think there's a valuable lesson we can learn here about Abraham being a model of faith. Faith requires sacrifice. Well, look at what God did to us. Faith requires sacrifice, and he sacrificed his son for us. Our faith is based on that premise. And Abraham is the first person in all the scripture to model that.